Hello, we're happy to be joining you today for the conference of the National Council of Public History. We're joined today with Dr. Jackie Thompson. I'm Tiffany Greene. We're joined by Brooke Smart, Tamra Borchardt-Slayton, and Rebekah Clark. We're happy to be here and share with you a little bit about the project that Better Days 2020 has been working on for the last several years that we've all had a part in helping come to fruition. The title of our presentation today is Show and Tell, Engaging Young People in Utah Women's History. Like I said, this is the order that we'll be speaking in today. This is kind of a roadmap for where we're headed in our presentation. We're first going to hear from Illustrator Brooke Smart after I do a brief introduction. Then Tamra Borchardt-Slayton is going to be speaking with us. She's the chairperson of the Paiute Indian Tribe of Utah. Then we'll hear from Dr. Jackie Thompson, who's an educator specializing in equity, justice, and inclusion training. We will then hear from Rebekah Clark, who's an independent historian who has worked with Better Days, and I will wrap it up again at the end. Better Days is a Utah nonprofit that is dedicated to popularizing Utah women's history in creative and communal ways through education, legislation, and art. Last year, 2020, people in Utah had a lot of reasons to celebrate, a lot of anniversaries to commemorate, especially when it came to voting rights for women. We had the 105th anniversary of Utah women's first votes. February 14th, 1870 marked the first time any woman in the United States voted under an equal suffrage law, and that happened here in Utah. It was also the centennial anniversary of the 19th Amendment, as well as the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that expanded voting rights for people of color. Better Days committed to this celebration and sharing these awesome anniversaries with the state of Utah. And as part of that, our education director, Naomi Watkins, and our historical director, Catherine Kitterman, created an educational website and curriculum that can be found at utahwomenshistory.org. As part of this website, Naomi, our education director, developed many lesson plans for teachers to use throughout the state. She developed them and put them here on our website, and also trained thousands of Utah teachers to use this curriculum to share the unique way that Utah women have played a role in voting rights history across our state and in our nation, and also sharing the way that Utah women have influenced our communities for good. We also have on our website, our Utah Women's History website, a lot of activities for teachers and students, as well as families to use. We have a reader's theater for children. We have book lists and scavenger hunts, music, as well as videos that are supporting the curriculum that has been developed. I would say the highlight of the curriculum and what we're going to be talking most about today is our biographies and our illustrations that are part of utahwomenshistory.org. There are 50 illustrations and biographies altogether, and they make history come to life in a way that hasn't been shared with Utah students before. Narrowing it down to just 50 Utah women to honor in this way was definitely tricky because there's so many that we could share. It started out specifically with voting rights and women who advocated to expand those voting rights for women and also people of color here in Utah and in the nation. But then the scope also broadened to include women in Utah who have helped in many areas of community engagement. Those three that you see at the bottom of the screen there, Seraph Young Ford, Mignon Barker Richmond, and Janelle Anderson, will be talking a little bit more about in detail today, as well as many others, I'm sure. We developed these 50 illustrations into trading cards that had a little bit of the biographical information on the back, as well as the illustration on the front. And the research that goes into these biographical essays is going to be discussed in detail more. There was scholarly research that had to take place, but also oral histories and talking with family members and community members that knew the women that we highlighted will also be discussed in our presentation. There was a book, Champions of Change, that I think Brooke is going to be talking about in a little bit, and also Thinking Women, a timeline of suffrage in Utah that Rebekah will probably be talking about. One key event that we were able to have that I think might be of interest to those of the conference, since this is about public history and engaging the community and especially young people with history, is we were able to have, prior to the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, we were able to have an event up at the Utah State Capitol last February. The impetus was to celebrate the 105th anniversary of Utah women's first votes. And we were able to gather thousands of Utah students at the Capitol. They learned a song for the occasion and gathered there on the steps you see in front of the Utah Supreme Court and shared the song called Champions of Change that features women in Utah by name. These Utah students are now learning about Utah women in ways that hasn't been happening in Utah curriculum in the past. We also, in addition to the illustrations, which are so captivating, and the wonderful biographies that were attached to each of these illustrations, we also added a storytelling component, and that's what Dr. Jackie, she's pictured here, that's what she's going to be sharing with us today. Later on in the summer last year, we also installed a Women's History Memorial on the grounds of the Utah State Capitol. Again, to try and reach the public with this history. It's one thing to know these stories of these women and to have a website that we're hoping teachers use, but we really want to engage the public in understanding their past so that it can inform their present. There we have Brooke's illustrations again, that at this event we had for the unveiling of the memorial. We used her illustrations once again, and we had a storytelling component. There's Dr. Jackie again. The last thing I wanted to mention before we get to our individual presentations is that on our utahwomenshistory.org website, we also have included local histories of all the 29 counties in Utah, as well as our tribal lands. If you go to our local histories page, we have a map of all of the counties, and we were able to uncover stories of women in the past in all of these counties. So students, as they learn of these things, can click on their individual county and find stories and pictures of women who lived where they lived and influenced their communities. We also have our tribal lands of Utah that we have stories that we're still developing for them as well, so that they can, all the Utah students can click here and learn of the community activism and the wonderful ways in which women have made Utah a great place to live. All right, I'm going to turn the time over to Brooke. We'll go from Brooke to Tamra to Dr. Jackie and to Rebekah.
Hi, I'm Brooke. So I am an illustrator and I focus a lot on brave women in history. And so when this project came up, it sounded so exciting and I really wanted to be part of it. And unlike some of my other jobs, usually I'm just kind of offered a job, you know, here's what the project is. We'd love to have you be the illustrator. For this one, I had to go in and interview and kind of prove that I was the right person for it. So I did a lot of research on Emmeline B. Wells, especially, and I went to there's a museum here called the Daughters of Utah. Daughters of the Utah Pioneers Museum. And so I went there and I did a bunch of research there, and then I met with the team of Better Days, and this was a few years ago when we started this. And then they ended up choosing me for this project. So it was really exciting. And it's been such a cool project. It took, I think, about 2 years for us to complete all of the illustrations because, and I'll talk about the process a little bit, just because sort of deciding which women to choose and then working with different families and different historians to get all of the research that we needed to complete their history in a very accurate way, and a very, we wanted them to be all encompassing, show their personal history as well as, maybe political or social history. So I have a little presentation. I wanted to show some of the illustrations that we created. The goal mainly for these, since we were sharing them with children, let's see, since we wanted to share them with children, usually if you think back to, some of the photographs that you've seen from the late 1800s or early 1900s, a lot of them are black and white and don't have a lot of emotion. And maybe you see these pictures of kind of stone-faced women and they kind of all look the same, they blend together. So our goal with these was to bring these women to life, show them in color, show them doing what they did, showing what, the impact that they made on Utah and on the world. And also we didn't want it just to be like a static portrait of them, because, that's sometimes all we had of these women. We just had a portrait. They're maybe standing in front of nothing. We wanted the illustration to tell more of their whole story. So every element in the illustration adds to their story. And we tried to get them to be as complete as we could in one illustration. There's sometimes, something that is hard to display in a visual way. But we did our best to kind of tell their whole story and to teach the children through the illustration who they are, because I have 3 kids, and when we're reading books, they notice all the details and they ask, why is she holding this? Or, why is her hair like that? What's she wearing? What's in the background? So children are really visual learners for the most part. They want to know, they're curious why these illustrations are the way that they are. So we wanted to, even without using the history, the reading part of learning about these women, we wanted the visual to kind of go along with it so that they can learn visually and then they can also read about the women. So this was really, really fun. We tried, I wasn't actually involved in choosing which women, sort of at the end, I sort of helped, but the Better Days team, mostly Catherine and Naomi, like Tiffany talked about, they sort of decided which women we should highlight. And it ended up being a really difficult job because we wanted to show lots of different backgrounds, different time periods, lots of different stories from Utah. And as we started digging, so more and more women just popped up. And so there are many more histories on the website that Tiffany mentioned, but the 50 that we focused on are sort of a good mix of backgrounds and really just wonderful, interesting women that we have from Utah. And it was very important to include all of the tribes in Utah, because we have just beautiful, beautiful stories from all of these different tribes about really awesome women that came from their communities. And so I just have a couple right here. Chapita from the Ute tribe, and then Annie Dodge Wanika is from the Navajo tribe. And I'm going to show you in some images a little farther on kind of how I compile everything and put together the sketches. It was really important with all of our women to kind of get everything right. We don't want to have something that's maybe culturally insensitive. We want it to be really empowering and beautiful and really represent that woman, and in these cases, represent their tribe. But I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about that later on from Tamra. Do you want to move to the next one? So this is Helen Papanicholas on the left. I talked about her. She wrote The Peoples of Utah, or she edited it. And it has all of these different chapters about different groups of people, different communities in Utah, and then their backgrounds. And so this one was a really fun one to do because there are so many photographs in The Peoples of Utah. And so I actually took the photographs and then created illustrations from a bunch of them to create these little stories, these bubbles coming out of the book. So each illustration was a little bit different. I wanted to create a unique illustration with a unique composition for each woman, just so that we're not flipping through a bunch of cards or, looking at an exhibit and it's all the same. And again, I wanted to tell their story in their way and to represent them. And so each one kind of was a little bit of a different approach. And I'll talk about the process in just a second here, but the Kanab Town Council was an interesting one because these 5 women were put on the ballot. Nobody was running for the town council. And so someone, as a joke, put these women on the ballot and they were elected as a joke. But when they found out that they were elected, they just all decided that they were going to do it. So they went forward with it and they served together for 1 year, I believe. And they made a big difference in the town. It was an interesting, I think, year for that town because nobody really wanted to answer to women. They weren't used to having women as their bosses. So the women with the town council would hire like a strong man to go and enforce their rules. And then I think they went through like 7 or 8 of these men throughout their year because that man that was working for them didn't like working for women, so they'd quit. But they ended up, like taking charge and doing it, even though it was a joke. So I thought it's a really cool story. Okay, so I wanted to talk just a little bit about the process. So this is kind of how I work. I work digitally when I'm doing my sketch phase, and then I paint everything with watercolor in the end. So it starts with research, and a lot of the research was done by our team of historians at Better Days. And then I would work with Catherine, who is the head, or what do you call it? The head historian on the team. And so I would get the research that the historian for that woman had done. And so I had all this great research that had been done. And then I would do my own research, look up photos, find old books, scan things in, look on the internet and try and compile a bunch of photos together. And then I would put them all together here so I work in the app Procreate on my iPad, and I just sketch right on the iPad. And it's really nice because I can just pull photos in right next to what I'm working on. And then, kind of take them away and put them back in if I need them. So for this one, here's a bunch of the photos that I've put together. I wanted to include a lot of these details. This is Violet Bear Allen. So I wanted to include a bunch of these details in her illustration. She liked to make these moccasins and sell them, and these beautiful beaded necklaces. And then it's, working with her family. So we would talk with families if we could, or anyone that had known the person or had done research on them, and we'd get more personal details. So her family were kind enough to help us, and for this one, it's always so nice to work with families because we get these personal things. But they talked about how she had her cat, and the cat was always kind of working in her studio, or like in her studio with her, and then out the window she had this lemon tree. So I thought those were kind of fun, and lots of plants around that they said. So these are just personal details that are kind of fun to include, make it really personal to that person. And so I would do the sketch, and then I would send it to Catherine and Naomi. They would look over it and then, send it on to the historian that had worked on the research for that woman, and then send it to family members. And then once I got all of my notes, I would revise anything. And then once I had approval, then I would do the final painting. So each one of them took a little bit of time. So I was often working on a bunch at once, kind of waiting on approval for some of them, and working on sketches for some, and then working on the finals. So it was a big job, all encompassing, definitely overwhelming at times, but in such a good way. I learned so much about each of these women, and it was fun to, you know, have a hand in teaching the children in Utah about these amazing role models. So I think if you go to the next slide, you can see the finished one for this one. It's a bit cropped. So, and then one other part, so we always include the woman's name, and then if there's like a quote that she said, or sometimes we couldn't find a quote by the woman, so we would have something that was said about her, or kind of a little description of something important in her life. Usually we could find a quote, which was really cool, and kind of I added to the illustration. So yes, so that's sort of the process. And then I think Tiffany showed these last two slides kind of already, but we ended up making them, all 50 of them are in this set of trading cards, and they have a kind of a brief biography on the back, and then the illustration on the front, and then on the back we have a photograph if we had one of the women. And I think we ended up with photographs of almost, I think, everyone by the end, yeah, or almost everyone. And then 25 of them were made into this book, Champions of Change, 25 Women Who Made History. And we're hoping that a second one will be made with the other 25. But it has a little longer of a biography next to the illustration, so that's kind of nice. And it kind of was, there was no real rhyme or reason to which ones made it into this book. It was mostly kind of what was done at the time, but it's still a pretty good mix. But anyway, thank you. It was such a fun project, and it's still fun to see kind of where it's gone and how it's impacted children. So.
It's my turn. Hello. My Kwestahoven Naninian Tamra Borchardt-Slayton. I'm the chairperson for the Paiute Indian Tribe of Utah, and I'm here to discuss the individual that we chose to represent us, the Paiute Indian Tribe of Utah, for the Better Days 2020 project. So as the chairperson of the Paiute Indian Tribe, I had the pleasure of trying to identify the individual that would represent the tribe based on the requirements that had been given to complete the project at hand. The Paiute Indian Tribe of Utah being a fairly new tribe. By being fairly new, I mean federal recognition within the last 4 years. It's a long history. It could go on for hours. But the bands themselves have been here an all-time and immemorial. But we had to look at our leaders for the past 40 years and who we could identify would meet the criteria for this specific project and who would be able to represent the tribe. So that individual that we chose was Janelle Anderson, and lucky for me, that's my aunt. So I knew her personally, I knew her story, and it wasn't difficult for me to write about because she is someone that I grew up admiring and knowing. Prior to this project, we were looking at old newspaper articles. So I was able to come up with the little tagline or the slogan that went above her portrait, and it was, "How committed are we?" And the reason why that is important to us, because when she was retiring, she gave this speech to tribal members, and she was retiring from tribal politics completely. So she made a very moving speech that included asking each and every tribal member, how committed are we in seeing the tribe moving forward, and how each of us had a flame in us in order for the tribe to continue to progress. So Janelle was a fierce woman and a leader. I had the pleasure of watching this as a little girl, and I watched the sacrifices she made and how she was able to lead an entire tribal nation and help form the existing government that we have today. As she traveled advocating for various issues, we got to hear the stories from wherever she went, from when she came home. She always loved visiting the colleges and universities that were around, and she'd always bring us a shirt home. So if I remember correctly, she went to Boston, so we all got Harvard t-shirts. And that was because my family believes in education. We were very strict on education, and Janelle was very adamant that we needed to obtain a degree so that we could have a better future and achieve goals. She also gave great advice. She would tell us, not if or when we worked for the tribe, that we needed to make sure that we treated every single individual as an individual with no special treatment. So she instilled in us that we have no family when we go to work. So that's something that I know today, and I still utilize to this day. I don't have family because no one gets special treatment. And that was one of her main objectives, is everybody's treated fairly. So the history of the Paiute tribe and bands are very turbulent. But the one thing that we can count on is the oral histories that are passed down from generation to generation. I do know that the Paiutes are a matrilineal society, that women help make decisions. The history of the tribe illustrates that matrilineal society that we still use today. Currently, our current tribal council, which is all elected officials, are female. That's not unusual for us. So every single person that has been elected currently is a woman that sits there. I believe in showing women in leadership to younger generations that will have, hopefully, younger women that will want to run for elected positions, not just tribal positions, county, state, federal elections. It's important for them to see representation of who they are. I believe that teaching our younger generations and providing cultural education, they're able to learn who they are and eventually become strong advocates for Indian country, because representation does matter. And we know this from various studies. We know this to be true. I never imagined as a young woman that I'd want to be an elected official for an entire tribal nation. I witnessed this as a child, but I really didn't think that it was going to be something that I would want to do. Because I watched all the sacrifices Janelle made. I saw all the glorious things that she did. And then I also saw her make tough decisions and be emotional and cry because she didn't know how to fix it. So I was like, that's not a job I personally want. But then growing up and watching those strong individual women in my life, especially my Aunt Janelle, 4 years ago, I went on a journey and I didn't like the policies that the tribe had, but I knew in order to change those policies, I would have to become an elected official. So I started that journey that I didn't think at the time I could do. And I drew my strength from her and from my mother and my grandmothers, because everything I witnessed as a little girl, I witnessed from them and those oral histories that they taught me. So what I could only hope is for little girls that see me, they'll want to do the same thing when they become an adult because of what I witnessed as a child. I know this is true because I have a little girl and she gets dragged to events with me, or she hears me giving various discussions or going to various meetings on Zoom because of COVID. So she got to learn how to be quiet when I'm in a meeting. But then I also get to hear it from my nieces and my nephews, specifically my little nieces that think I'm a celebrity, especially when they go on to some Zoom event I'm on and their moms make them watch. So they get to tell me, Auntie, you're a celebrity. I watched you on the computer. And I was like, if you only knew I'm not a celebrity. But representation matters. and because I'm there representing a tribe and I'm there advocating for a tribe, just like I saw as a child, Janelle advocating for a tribe, and just all those other integral Native American women like Wilma Mankiller. Trying to think of some off the top of my head, and Wilma's the only one that appears, but that I could think of at the moment. But they're important for us because they're showing our little girls that they could do and become anything that they want to be. So I believe that representation matters, as I just said. And that's why I believe Better Days 2020 project had a huge impact on Utah specifically, because they were able to show an array of women and how they impacted the state of Utah and those histories that no one knows about, or didn't know about, or only a handful of us knew about. They were able to make sure that every single race was included in this project, and that's important, because that little girl, it could be my little girl that didn't know something, she was able to learn from this project. I remember going to the Capitol, and I'm not sure which one it was. I think it was the second one, where we were in the rotunda and we were looking at all the pictures. That was the most amazing thing to watch my little girl and my little boy, because they were able to go around and they were able to look at these pictures and learn these stories just off the little cards, and see amazing women and what they did to shape Utah's history. So in conclusion, women are vital to our tribal histories and our national history, because they help us teach, share, and let us know that the decisions that have been made, they've been there. Even if they weren't pictured at the forefront and they weren't in the background, women were there, helping make those decisions. Women are life givers, and they're an important aspect to any tribal history, along with regular history, especially Indigenous history, because it's important for everyone to understand Utah's history, especially the Indigenous history that there is, because it's not fairly known. A lot of individuals have no idea. If you ask them if there's I deal with it here in Cedar City, if there's a tribal nation where they're at, they have no idea there's a reservation within the city limits. So they're shocked, but it's a history that they need to know. And then history is a vital part. Oral histories are super important, because without those histories, I wouldn't know my history. My history wasn't written down. It was told to me as a child orally. They, my ancestors obviously didn't have pieces of paper, and they didn't think about writing things down, but significantly during certain seasons, they would share why the season was important and why this is significant to us. And that is very important. So those oral histories are super important, especially to Utah tribes, because, oh, I'm like disappearing. But this project and everything that I learned through this project, learning about the different women and highlighting my aunt, Janelle Anderson, and along with the other Indigenous women, were eye-opening, because I didn't know some of those histories. So it taught me a lot in this process, and I was thankful to be a part of it. So I know my remarks were kind of brief, but I'm done. So thank you.
So, hello everyone. I'm happy to be here with all of you. I'm enjoying these stories so much, and so appreciative to Better Days 2020. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so my name is Dr. Jackie Thompson. You can call me Dr. Jackie. I was so honored to be a part of the Better Days 2020 project and very excited to have the opportunity to portray Mrs. Mignon Barker Richmond. I learned so much about her. I want to thank you, Brooke, for this beautiful illustration. The illustration has her whole life story pretty much on there. And so it was beautiful. I would take it with me when I go into the schools. When I did the research, I wrote about Mrs. Mignon Barker's life, and then also would portray her through storytelling. And it started with Mrs. Emma Houston. She knew that I liked to portray famous African Americans or prominent African Americans. And she asked me if I would portray Mignon. And I said to her, well, who is she? Tell me all about her. And I said, I'd be happy to portray her. Let me have a chance just to do some research. And so I worked with Miss Catherine Kitterman and the Better Days 2020 staff, and they asked me to write Mignon's story. I met with Mignon's pastor, Reverend Francis Davis, who at the time, he was a pastor of Calvary Baptist Church. And he told me all about her. He gave me articles. He had wrote a book called Light in the Midst of Zion, and she was featured in there as well. He gave me contact information for Mignon's family members, and I was able to contact her niece, Mignon Mapp, who lives in Atlanta, and also her family that lives right here in Salt Lake. They continue, even up into today, they'll call and say, I found, Dr. Jackie, I found a treasure trove. I found more pictures. I'm going to send them to you. So through the photographs, the articles, and the stories, this helped me to put her life story together. It was like a puzzle, and there's still pieces that are coming to it. Information from the Utah Historical Society and Utah State University were very vital as I put this together. When I look at the value of storytelling and presenting to younger audience, it's exciting. You can tell children about history, or you can show them history through Brooke's beautiful illustrations. And when I do the character portrayal, it's fun because it brings history to life. And the students connect with the stories. It helps them develop empathy and become social justice advocates. In sharing diverse perspectives and stories, I like what Tamra said. She talked so much that we must have representation. And we must tell not only his story, but her story too, and fill in the missing pages of the history book. And that's what Better Days 2020 has done for our school children and educators. We must honor the past to ensure the future. For this truly gives our children a sense of belonging when they see the contributions of their ancestors, and then they appreciate the contribution of others. Okay, so Miss Mignon Barker Richmond was born on April 1st, 1897 in Salt Lake City. Her mother was an English woman from London, and this is a picture of her sister Mary. Her father, he was born in slavery in Missouri. He ran away, joined the army. He got recaptured, and then he ran away again, and he ended up in Salt Lake, and that's where Mignon's mother and father met while they worked at a hotel. She attended Calvary Baptist Church, and she was Sunday school superintendent. Here's a picture of Mignon and her sister Mary. These photographs really help because you could see what she wore during that time, as Brooke talked about. Mignon attended Utah State Agricultural College, which is today known as Utah State University, and she was a part of the class of 1921. You could read her full biography in Better Days 2020 publication. Here's her daughter, Ophelia, and her husband, Mr. Richmond. Ophelia was her daughter by marriage. She had no children of her own, but she loved Ophelia, and Ophelia loved her, so she raised her as her own. Mignon was friends with Langston Hughes, and he was a Harlem Renaissance poet, and it was pretty exciting because he'd come and he'd visit Mignon, and he would spend the time at her home just to rest from the hustle and bustle of New York. He wrote beautiful poetry such as I Too Sing America. She was also friends with Wallace Thurman, and he was a Harlem Renaissance writer. He was right here from Salt Lake City, Utah. He wrote the book, The Darker the Berry, a novel of Negro life. And these are pictures that her family was sending to me. Did you know that it would be 27 years before Mignon could get hired in her field after graduating from college? So when World War II broke out, they recognized her community skills, and she worked with USO community service volunteers with the Red Cross. She also worked with Utah women who were working during World War II. She would fix breakfast for them at the YWCA when they got off their night shift. Finally, in 1948, 27 years after she graduated from Utah State Agricultural College, the University of Utah hired her to start the first school lunch program at Stewart Elementary School. So that was exciting. Mignon did retire, and she received several awards. She said at age 80 when she received an award that her life has been children. There's Mignon with her sister Mary and the young babies. Mignon had a great sense of humor, and it was exciting because she said that sense of humor would help me. And she had a strong faith in God, and her mother encouraged her to do all things. But she said one time I went to an event at a hotel in Utah, and they asked me to use the servants' entrance. And I laughed and said, I'm just like Marian Anderson, the great opera singer. When she came to Hotel Utah, they had her use the freight elevator. But Mignon and Marian both refused to let racism stand in their way. She received numerous awards. She helped with legislation to fight against poverty. And a great honor bestowed upon her was when Calvary Baptist Church, and also in addition to Trinity AMN Church and the Salt Lake NAACP, dedicated a park in her honor in 1986. Just last year, this park also became a community garden. You'll see the volunteers working there. And you could see how well taken care of her community garden is, the way that Mignon took care of community herself. There's a Utah Women 2020 mural that was commissioned by Zions Bank, and it features 250 women across the Beehive State of all backgrounds. And Mignon is a part of this beautiful mural. You can read more about that as well. She had a great saying, turn failure into victory. Don't let your courage fade. And if you get a lemon, just make lemonade. She truly had a life full of service. She passed away on March 10th, 1984. Mignon Barker Richmond has left a rich history for all of us. In closing, I'd like to show you a slideshow of the things that we did throughout the year.
You're broken down and tired of living life on the merry-go-round, and you can't find a fighter, but I see it in you, so we gon' walk it out. Move mountains, we gon' walk it out and move mountains. And I'll rise like the day. I'll rise up, I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. And I'll rise up, I like the waves. I'll rise up, in spite of the ache. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. The silence isn't quiet, and it feels like it's getting hard to breathe. And I know you feel like dying. again. But I promise we would take the world to its feet. Move mountains, bring it to its feet. Move mountains. And I'll rise up, I'll rise like the day. I'll rise up, I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. That we have each other, and for that we have each other, and we will rise, we will rise, we will rise, we'll rise. I'll rise up, rise like the day. I'll rise up in spite of the ache. I will rise 1,000 times again, and we'll rise up.
Well, thank you. It's been an honor and a blessing and privilege to be with all of you and to be a part of this Better Days 2020 project. And again, our children are our present and our future. It benefits our young women, and it benefits our sons and daughters, and all of them. And so thank you again, and I'm happy to be here with you today.
Thank you, Dr. Jackie.
You're
And
welcome.
I was getting emotional during the slideshow, going back through all those memories. So my name is Rebekah Clark, and I'm getting emotional about all this because I've been with Better Days working as a historian for over 3 years now. And during this time, I've been changed by it. I've worked extensively on the biographies. I also co-authored the book, Thinking Women, A Timeline of Suffrage in Utah with Catherine Kitterman, the historical director of Better Days. And it's just been an honor to work with the talented women that you've just heard from and the rest of the Better Days team. More importantly, it's been a really deep privilege to uncover and share the stories of all these remarkable women from the history of our state. I've learned through this process what a great need there is for public history and how important it is. Until the work that was done by Better Days 2020 over the past few years, this aspect of Utah's history really had largely slipped into at least public obscurity. It was residing mostly in academic journals. And this unique Western suffrage story and story of women in leadership and advocacy needs to be known, needs to be told. It adds depth and complexity to the national story, and it also helps shape Utah's cultural identity as well. Today, the Better Days team has been motivated from the start by the belief that expanding public knowledge about women's past efforts for equality has the capacity to strengthen future communities, just like Dr. Jackie was saying. But to do that, it's so crucial that we engage young people and the general population in that narrative. This belief has propelled our efforts to incorporate more women's history into the classroom, into our communities, in a meaningful and a representative and a diverse way. Finding women in historical records is a unique challenge no matter what time period you are looking at. With this story in particular, it often felt like an excavation, more than just research. And women's voices and their experiences are often marginalized in historical records. They're at times completely missing in the written record. And as Tamra mentioned, that's especially true with Indigenous peoples' history. And turning to oral history and traditions becomes incredibly important in those situations. But even when women are in the records, those records are often skewed with distortions and omissions. And the historical records are often documenting the male leaders' actions and perspectives, and women are kind of on the fringes if they appear at all. Things like common practice of identifying women by their husband's last name makes it so incredibly difficult and frustrating as historians to identify these women with their individual identities and even find out what their names are. So we ran against that over and over because of the era that we were working in. As we were working to reinsert women's voices and their experiences and their contributions back into the narrative, we scoured primary sources and any secondary sources that had been written that we could find. We were looking through letters, journals, newspapers, meeting minutes, legislative records, photographs were a really priceless resource to give that visual imagery and story that just public records wouldn't normally have shown, and then archival collections. And we were just looking to uncover often just hints or nuggets that we could piece together, like the puzzle that Dr. Jackie was talking about, so that we could find a more accurate portrayal of the role that women played in shaping our history. So my first two assignments when I began more than 3 years ago were for Martha Hughes Cannon. I requested her because she had been a longtime favorite of mine in my academic studies on this topic. And then Seraph Young, who I had never heard of before, and turns out most people hadn't at that point. So Seraph Young made history in 1870 on Valentine's Day when she got up early and showed up at the polls early on her way to go teach school. And she became the first woman in the United States to vote and cast her vote in an election under an equal suffrage law that granted equal suffrage to all women citizens. This was a full 50 years before the 19th Amendment. And that was a big deal. And yet, at this point where I was starting my research, Seraph Young was almost entirely unknown, even to me, and I had been researching for years on Utah women's suffrage. She only shows up in a handful of sources. It's just mentioned that she was the first woman that cast the vote. So it took a lot of digging. And my first task was really confronting a lot of historical inaccuracies in the sources at the time and in sources that then were based off of those sources. So things like photographs that were being mislabeled with another woman's name. And so trying to track down, is this her or is it not? Because we were preparing for Brooke's illustrations. So those photographs really mattered. Even her, this one kills me, but even her gravestone in Arlington Cemetery had her name misspelled. And it was such a testament to how this historic woman had really been lost to history. And there were even really critical points that as we were beginning this process of pinning down, when that election took place and was it really the first election? Wyoming has long claimed that they had the first woman to vote there. And so we had to verify the timing of that election, that Wyoming indeed granted women's suffrage about 2 months before Utah did, but Utah held the first elections. And so the women here were actually casting their votes first, which makes Seraph then the first to cast that vote in the nation. Over time, as we dug further and further, we discovered more sources. We learned about her family life after she moved away from Utah. We discovered descendants that we hadn't known about before because she had complicated family relationships, and that she continued interest in women's activism and organizing. And those descendants were able to be there in Washington, D.C. at Arlington Cemetery just this past fall, when after was last year of Catherine Kitterman really spearheading, trying to get that gravestone changed. It was finally changed this fall, and her descendants were able to be there to be honored and to honor her and to have that important memorial to her be corrected. And this ongoing process of gaining information little by little about her is continuing. Just a few weeks ago, we had someone in our network reach out that they had found another, sorry, I'm realizing I need to click through here so you can see Sarah. There she is. So we've gotten new photographs along the way that are showing different sides of her at different times in her life. And the memorial that Tiffany mentioned at the beginning, we just unveiled last August in conjunction with the 19th Amendment Centennial celebrations. And it was placed on the grounds of Council Hall, where Seraph Young cast that first historic vote. It's right across from the state capitol building. And the memorial begins with Seraph's footprint, that she was the one that started this path. And you can see that it's an interactive memorial, a tribute to the many women and the expanding legislation that followed to expand those rights and move us forward toward greater equality on this continuing path. And I loved being there that night for that unveiling and seeing Seraph's contribution is no longer unknown. And that's largely due to the research that we've been doing over the last few years. I also had the opportunity to work on the Martha Hugh Cannon biography. Now, Martha is more well-known in certain academic circles at the beginning, but was still 3 years ago largely unknown. And we have a lot of public records. It was easier to find things about Martha because she was a public figure, and so we have some of those public records, but she destroyed her personal records. And it makes it very difficult to piece together the kind of the backstory and the behind the scenes parts of the stories. And those are the really compelling parts we have found as we are teaching students and teaching the community. Alice Merrill Horn's journal records an instance where when the two big bills that Alice and Martha were promoting that they had introduced were the state art bill and then the state public health bill. And these bills meant a lot to these women. This is legislation they wanted to make sure got passed. And so as it was coming up for a vote, they would scatter yellow flowers onto the desks of their male colleagues in the House and the Senate. And it was a very not so subtle reminder of the strength of the women's vote that was really just still so new at this time. And so we get these really compelling stories as we are learned more about Martha. And as on the 150th anniversary celebrations that we had last February at the state capitol, when we had thousands of students come, I was telling this story to a junior high student, and she just was sort of so captivated by these women who were serving in the early legislature. And when I told her about the flowers, she stopped and said, "That sounds like something I would do." And I loved watching that moment where it clicked and she connected with these women that we've been researching that have become so personal to me and to the other women who have worked with us with Better Days. And to see students start connecting and drawing inspiration and common ground with these women was and has been throughout this process a very special part of the experience for me. We've gone through this process for, as the other women and the other panelists have mentioned, for so all of the women that we've done the biographies for, the illustrations for. We're trying so hard to give accurate and representative views of that individual's life, and also accurate and representative views of Utah's various communities. We strongly recognize that our collective history needs to represent all participants. And when that story is more inclusive and more complete, it becomes more powerful. Suffrage itself, for the women who were fighting for suffrage, was never the end goal. It was just the gateway for entrance into the public sphere so that they could make their presence felt and their voice heard and make a difference in their communities. And similarly, suffrage was never our end goal. It was a gateway to use those suffrage anniversaries that we could draw attention to and form celebrations around, and then use that as a way to open the door to this gateway of women's leadership and this rich history that we have here in Utah and in this nation of women making their voices heard and making a difference in their communities. And these women's stories and their contributions to our state, making those more visible is so critical. And suffrage opens the door to that, but it's clearly not the end. And the journey to achieve greater rights and equality is continuing. And so as we explore the successes and also the limitations of our past, it's been important to us that the connection to that is to inspire us to follow that legacy and to make our own presence felt and our voice heard. And I hope that that is what we've accomplished with what we've done. I know that I have personally grown so much from this process and working on this history. So I will stop there and let you take it away, Tiffany.
We hope that you guys, those who have joined us at this conference, have enjoyed learning about these incredible Utah women and have also learned something new about how we all, with a vested interest in public history, can find ways to make history come alive for young people and for people young at heart. When we are able to read history and see history and hear history, that's when it really comes alive. And making all of those components work in concert with each other, bringing the research through oral history as well as academic and interviews with family members, bringing that together with engaging illustrations as well as a live storytelling component. We hope that that has inspired other public historians to engage in the work and to continue to make the history that we want shared with our young people accessible to everyone. So enjoy the rest of the conference and thank you for tuning in.